Macronutrients are nutrients which contribute to dietary energy intake. So the main ones are fat, protein and carbohydrates. Fat contributes 37 kilojoules of energy per gram, while protein and carbohydrates contribute 17 kilojoules per gram. Alcohol also contributes to intake as it provides 29 kilojoules per gram. So there is a range of nutrient reference values in relation to macronutrients, which we'll be discussing today, as well as the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating has some guidelines which influence the intake as well. So the research that I'll be basing the discussion on today is the Australian Health Survey, so 2011 to 2012, because that has a lot of information about the intakes of Australians. So data from the Australian Health Survey shows that targets are being met in accordance with the NRVs in terms of protein. So 99% of Australians are consuming their RDI for protein. The only group that had a slight issue was the over 70s group. So it was found that 14% of males and 4% of females were not meeting their protein requirements. Then in terms of the AMDR, so the acceptable macronutrient density ranges, which is 15 to 25% is what's recommended. Only 13% of males and 11% of females don't reach the minimum 15%. So overall, we're doing pretty well in terms of protein intake. Then we'll look at carbohydrates. So the acceptable macronutrient density range, distribution range for carbohydrates is 45 to 65%. So it was surprising to me, but 51% of Australians had less than 45% of their energy coming from carbohydrates. So not enough carbohydrates in relation to the other nutrients. And then there's no specific NRV for carbohydrate intakes in terms of RDI, EAR, etc., other than just for 1-year-olds. So just some information that I did find though was that 25% of the population, so the top 25%, consume at least 100 grams of sugar per day. So that's added and natural sugars together, which means that the other 75% are consuming less than 100 grams of carbohydrates in total per day. Similar to carbohydrates, it's difficult to look at the NRVs for fat because, so there's obviously, we know there's saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, and polyunsaturated fat. So there's only recommendations for polyunsaturated fat, as saturated fat and monounsaturated fats are not required in the diet. They can be synthesized by the body if they're required. But overall, the intake for fat for males 9 to 50 years was 79 to 89 grams per day, while females were having 64 to 69 grams per day. So females are having less fat than males. And then there is an AMDR, of course, for fats, so that is 20 to 35% of intake. And majority of people are meeting this recommendation, with only 13% of males and 16% of females exceeding the 35%, but it was found that majority are within that range. So next we'll look at the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. So most people, when they think of that, they're thinking about the food groups and how many they need, and the food groups aren't specific to macronutrients, they're to the groups. So I decided to focus on this guideline. So that is that you are required to limit intakes of foods containing saturated fat, added salt, added sugars and alcohol. So firstly, looking at added sugars, obviously that is a part of the carbohydrate macronutrients. So it was found that on average Australians are consuming 52 grams of added sugars per day. So that's 12 teaspoons of added sugars. So there's no NRV for added sugars, as we've discussed, but the World Health Organization recommends that you have no more than 25 grams of added sugars per day. So clearly there's a little bit too much of that being consumed, and that could be overriding more quality carbohydrates that you should be intaking. Then with saturated fat, we've got people are consuming 31% of their total energy from fat, which is good because, as we looked at before, that's within that AMDR range. But 12% of that is from saturated fat, 12% from monounsaturated fat, and 4.7% from polyunsaturated fat. So there's a lot coming from those fats that aren't necessarily required or considered to be particularly healthy. And then alcohol. I think alcohol is a really interesting thing to discuss. So some people consider it a macronutrient, others don't, but it does contribute to energy. So within the acceptable macronutrient density ranges, doesn't really consider anything other than fat, protein, and carbs. But people are consuming a significant amount of their energy from alcohol, so that really needs to be considered within weight gain, etc. So it's recommended that by the Australian Bureau of Statistics that you consume no more than 5% of your energy intake from alcohol. But as the stats show here, there's 40% of males and 30% of females consumed more than the 5%. And then there's this graph, and that shows just the percentage of people per age group that are exceeding that 5%. So it's consistently higher for males than females, but for both it's a significant amount of people that are having, I guess, excessive energy intake from alcohol. So overall, we can see that in general, we're consuming adequate amounts of protein and fat, although there might be a little bit too much saturated fat being consumed. And with carbohydrates, we're not consuming enough quality carbohydrates, and a lot of energy is coming from refined carbohydrates and added sugars. As well as that, we're consuming a large proportion of our energy intake from alcohol, which isn't recommended. So then the implications for the future. So with saturated fat is associated with increasing cholesterol in the blood. And as we know, high cholesterol is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So continuing to have more bad fats than good fats is likely to continue increasing the prevalence of cardiovascular disease. It's been found that excess sugar intake increases weight, and then people who consume less added sugars will have a lower body weight. So continuing having large amounts of added sugars in the diet is going to increase the overweight and obesity into the future. And then high alcohol consumption is also associated with weight gain, but is also a risk factor for chronic disease. So there's that problem with obesity, but also more people getting sick, more issues, more pressure on the healthcare system. So I think that a focus needs to be made to switching to the right kind of macronutrients. So rather than just looking at the distribution of macronutrients, looking at the types of them. So your saturated fat or your polyunsaturated fat and your added sugars compared to your natural sugars. So yeah, looking at the quality of the foods rather than the quantity maybe of each macronutrient. And yeah, so it's important that people start consuming healthier fats and quality carbohydrates, and just for optimal health. Yeah, and here's my references.